This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is brought to you by Audible, a leading provider of downloadable audiobooks. Get a free audiobook download when you sign up for a 30-day free trial over at audible.com/galaxy. Today's show is also brought to you by Atom Tickets, moviegoing for the 21st century. Atom Tickets is a free app that lets you plan movie outings with your friends, and also lets you pay for tickets and snacks ahead of time, letting you skip the long lines. Get $5 off your first order by using the promo code GALAXY. So again, the app is called Atom Tickets, ATOM Tickets, and don't forget to use the promo code GALAXY.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 238 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Bruce Sterling. He's the author of novels such as Gizmatrix, Love is Strange, and Islands in the Net, and he's also the editor of the seminal cyberpunk anthology Mirror Shades. Together with William Gibson, he wrote the classic steampunk novel The Difference Engine, and his nonfiction books include Hacker Crackdown, Tomorrow Now, and The Epic Struggle of the Internet of Things. His articles appear in Newsweek, Nature, and the New York Times, and he's been featured on TV shows such as ABC's Nightline, BBC's The Late Show, and CBC's Morningside. And we'll be speaking with him today about his new book Pirate Utopia, an alternate history set shortly after World War I. And today's show is brought to you by Audible, a leading provider of downloadable audiobooks. I've been an Audible customer for over a decade and have bought over 160 audiobooks through the site. At one point, I actually had 3 different Audible accounts because I was going through audiobooks so quickly, so I can definitely state from experience that it's a great site that sells lots of great audiobooks. If you want to give them a try, you should head on over to audible.com/galaxy, where you can get a free audiobook download when you sign up for a 30-day free trial. And if you're a Bruce Sterling fan, which seems likely if you're listening to this episode, then I just want to point out that Audible's library includes the classic steampunk novel The Difference Engine, which Bruce wrote with fellow science fiction legend William Gibson. Audible's library also includes Bruce's novels Zeitgeist and The Caryatids, and all 3 of those books are available now as unabridged recordings. So again, just head on over to audible.com/galaxy and download any one of those books for free when you sign up for a 30-day free trial. Alright, and so now let's get to our interview. Alright, so we're here with Bruce Sterling. Welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot, man.
Okay, so it says in your bio that you live in Austin, Turin, and Belgrade. So I was just curious about how you settled on Turin and Belgrade as your second and third homes.
I married a Serbian woman, so that counts for glamorous Beograd. And then she and I were invited to Torino some years ago to be the curators of an electronic art fair, which is called Share Festival. So, we were here for a year working on this art fair, and we're still on their jury and board of directors. So, after that, we just decided that Italy suited both of us better than either of our native countries do.
And so what sort of a science fiction scene is there in Italy and in Serbia?
In Serbia, they've got, a little Fantastica thing, but, it used to be bigger because there was more Yugoslav publishing going on. Whereas, in Italy, you've got, well over 100 years of kind of fantasy writing, fantascienza, they call it. There were sort of pulp magazines in the 1950s, 60s. They were kind of, similar to mainstream American publications of the 50s and 60s. And they're like national fantascienza conventions and, some pretty well-known fantascienza colleagues of mine. And I actually take those guys quite seriously. I really enjoy the Italian approach to fantasy writing.
So in your author photo in this book, you're standing in front of something that says Italo Calvino. What is that exactly?
Well, that's the neighborhood library here. I mean, that particular Calvino library is about, 500 meters away from my front door. And of course, it's named after Calvino because he's a Turinese writer. He was spent a lot of time here working for a publishing house and was known for, they've got a lot of his papers there and books and so forth.
Mm-hmm. So I've heard you talk about Cosmic Comics in particular or something. Is that your favorite Calvino or?
I actually like the short stories better. I think they're more experimental. And of course, I like to write short stories myself. I don't know. I mean, I mean, there's Calvino the critic. He wrote Why I Read the Classics, which I think is a really good kind of argument in behalf of literature. And I like his letters a lot. I think, I'm not super fond of his, well, actually, I am super fond of his work, but I'm even happier to sort of get under the guy's skin and see how he really thought about things.
Hmm. I mean, it was interesting in this book because you say that in Italy, it's kind of like the science fiction, mystery, and historical fiction is all one genre.
Well, I wouldn't say it's like that. I would just say that like genres don't actually work the way in Italian language publishing that they work in other forms of publishing. You really have to have a pretty well-developed continental-sized market to be able to afford genres. I mean, they're really kind of rare birds, and you have to have like a lot of muscle and a really big consumer base just to have, separated fandoms. So, people in Italian fantascienza tend to read a lot of English language style science fiction in translation. And they read, some French science fiction and some German and, maybe a little bit of Russian, but they don't really have, I mean, fantascienza as we know it is more like San Diego Comic Con style fandom than, like a literary science fiction fandom traditionally in the US.
Yeah. And you said that there's a much different character to fantascienza in some cities versus others?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I was a little bit surprised in coming to Italy to find out they had so much of what they call campanile,ismo, which is, a regional loyalty to the bell tower of your town, right? But, Italy's like the Balkans in some ways. I mean, it was like 7 different nations or states before like the 1860s. So it's a younger nation than the United States is, even though the cities are very old.
Yeah. Well, so you've been traveling then a lot, obviously, between Italy and Serbia. And so on the way you passed through Croatia. So tell us about how you got interested in the history of Rijeka, I guess you would say.
Yeah, Rijeka. Well, I knew about this particular political upheaval that had happened in Rijeka because it's rather famous in anarchist circles. I mean, it's just Rijeka is not that big a town, but it was a city that just sort of had this paramilitary upheaval and literally defied the whole world. So I had always wondered sort of exactly what went on there and what the heck these guys thought they were doing. And I'd been to the town a number of times, and I, picked up a little bit of historical material there and kind of got a feeling for the lay of the land. And then finally I decided, one day that I was just going to kind of knuckle down there and really try to reimagine it and describe it.
Well, I mean, for people who don't know, could you just say a little bit more about what happened there and why is it famous in anarchist circles?
Well, I mean, a lot of people say that Rijeka was the cradle of fascism. And, in some ways it was, because a lot of the guys who became big wheels in the Italian fascist movement were kind of gun-toting, swaggering, tough guys in Rijeka, right? But there was also just a lot of other weird stuff going on in Rijeka that was not fascism and could have sort of moved into, a lot of different directions. Anarcho-syndicalism, leftism, Trotskyite, whatever. There could have been a communist upheaval there. I mean, Lenin thought very well of them. Lenin thought that maybe they were going to be the first, genuinely communist revolution in Western Europe and so forth and so on. But, basically it was an area that the Italians thought they were going to get in the peace settlement and fold into the nation of Italy. But then after the United States entered the war, those agreements were nullified and there was a completely different, political arrangement. So the, Italian patriots felt cheated and they decided to just sort of invade this town and take it over.
Right. And so how does your fictional version differ from the historical version?
Basically it's got a technologist in it. It's the kind of guy who would have been a reader of Wired magazine at the time. I mean, the guy's, he talks like a science fiction fan in a lot of ways. He's actually more like a guy from the Maker movement. I mean, he's a person who's not a political pirate or a poetic pirate or even a fascist pirate. He's a technology pirate, right? Kind of a hacker figure. And they didn't really have any guys of that caliber in their movement. And I wondered what would have happened if they had. So I decided to invent one. And naturally, I made him the hero of my story.
Well, actually, why don't you say a little bit more about, because there's a lot of different sort of subject areas that feed into this book. So you have the Italian Futurists, and you mentioned anarcho-syndicalism. Could you just say a little bit about, just explain those concepts maybe for people who aren't familiar with them?
Well, it's easy to kind of frame them that way, but at the time when people were doing it, they just didn't know what the hell they were doing. I mean, really, I mean, if you were a futurist, you could sort of do anything. And, there was no real boss to tell you what to do, except for, Marinetti, who was the founder of the futurist movement, but kind of famously eccentric and just really a weird guy. I mean, he was the kind of guy who'd sort of light a fire in the basement and then just sort of wander off diagonally. So there wasn't really a lot of consistency there. But, the futurists were an art movement, and basically they just wanted to scrap everything that was in museums and start over with a kind of industrial, streamlined, high power, aggressive, very masculine, very, industrial kind of art that was all about movement and speed and frenzy and daring and, excitement and aggressively conquering problems and brutally dismissing the past and so forth and so on. But they wouldn't have been. I mean, as in terms of European art movements, they weren't really that big a deal. I mean, they weren't like a bigger deal than Expressionism or the Blue Rider in Germany or Mayakovsky's people in Russia or these other things. The thing that sort of made them notorious is that Mussolini took them under his wing. They became kind of the official fascist art movement.
Right, and you say in the book that Mussolini kind of stopped by Rijeka. I think it was called, I don't know, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Fiume, the city at the time.
Yeah, Fiume.
Fiume. That he sort of stopped by there, and there was a lot of sex and drugs and fascist indoctrination going on.
Yeah, well, at the time, Mussolini was just a newspaper editor. I mean, Mussolini was actually a guy of the left. He was basically an anarcho-socialist before he had this epiphany and, realized that he could get more done with tough guy squadrons of right-wing ex-military guys. I mean, he wanted to be in power, of course, but he thought if he had to be elected, he'd have to have the masses on his side. But then when he realized he could form squadrons of fascist bullies and just kind of seize power militarily, that was a lot more exciting to him. But at the time of this Rijeka business, as they call it, the Impresa de Fiume, the Fiume enterprise, Mussolini was not that big a deal. He was just, considered just another young war vet who happened to own a newspaper.
Right, and so there are a bunch of, like you mentioned, anarcho-syndicalism and the corporate syndicalism and anarcho-socialism. Which of those do you think is important for our listeners to understand to understand the context for your book? I
mean, I think it's kind of interesting that there actually was an anarcho-syndicalist constitution in Rijeka. Because it's a rather little known document, and there's a modern political movement here in Italy which is called the Movimento 5 Stelle, or the M5S, which is an electronic bulletin board group, basically bloggers who just formed a political party, quite some time ago, and may succeed in taking power. I mean, they're kind of the Trump populist camp in a lot of ways. And I once interviewed the guy who was kind of their, ideological organizer. I mean, basically, he was their system administrator. And he and I were talking about this anarcho-syndicalist constitution in Fiume. And he really knew a lot about it. I mean, his name was John Roberto Casaleggio. And he died recently, unfortunately. He, had a stroke and just keeled over. Wasn't that old a guy. Quite a loss to Italian public affairs, I think. But it interested me a lot that you had this kind of on the ground electronic democracy movement that thought of this Fiume document as a kind of living heritage thing, right? And I mean, it might have actually worked as a legal constitution because it divided society up into kind of 10 different camps or kind of power bases. And instead of being like the legislature and the judiciary and the executive, they were just like 10 different kinds of labor unions, basically. I mean, everything was divided up by the nature of like people's business activities and what they were doing, right? And then these labor unions would have these summits and they were supposed to decide where all the money and the venture capital and the resources were supposed to go. And, it wasn't communism and it wasn't capitalism. It was it was anarcho-syndicalism. It was a kind of anarchist labor union dominated imaginary society, just kind of a labor union utopia. And, people often say there's kind of, no alternative to capitalism or, communism is crushed forever. But this really is, a genuine attempt at a radically alternative kind of society.
Right. So this is basically the workers own the factory collectively and they vote on what they're going to make or what they're going to be paid and things like that. Is that right?
I think that's the simplest way for us to understand it. But, if you look at the document itself, it's more like this is society and it's an orchestra. And we're aiming to give people happy lives, and it's all about fulfillment. It's not merely a matter of kind of sitting down and making your numbers for the quarter, right? And it's not a labor union in the sense of like a labor union's trying to get a raise from the bosses, because there are no bosses. I mean, the laborers pretty much are the bosses. And the bosses are supposed to be working on this kind of scheme to create a kind of very high, kind of poetic and spiritually exalted kind of beautified life, right? But it's all about sort of civilized values and music and poetry and kind of dramatic exaltation and educating people and equal rights for all genders and colors, that sort of thing.
Right. So you say that these people had all these big ideas, but in real life they got crushed pretty quickly. But you say if they had a maker type character, like you imagine, that it could have led to sort of this Dieselpunk story, is what you call it.
Right. Well, there are aspects of it that sound rather open source, right? I mean, if you listen to guys in the open source movement, and of course I know tons of them, especially Italian ones, they have a similar kind of thing. It's like, well, you guys are like working on your fork, and we're like working on our fork, and we're gonna like complete this, and then you can build on top of the platform, right? I mean, that's rather Rijeka sounding. I mean, they're not labor unions, but they don't really have a boss. I mean, if you're like doing all this open source development, nobody really goes and tells you, like, okay, I'm paying you to go do X, Y, and Z. I mean, maybe they do if you're looking for like working for Microsoft's open source. But in general, it's just kind of these meetings of, guys in the movement who say, it'd be really convenient if our platform had the ability to do X, Y, and Z. And like, who's going to handle that? And like 3 guys raise their hands and then they're like sent off to, GitHub.
I mean, could you say a little bit more about why you call the book Dieselpunk?
Well, that's something of a joke. I mean, of course, I'm a cyberpunk. And I know we cyberpunks didn't make up that name, but we got it and we probably deserve it. And then there's steampunk, which is if you're writing about the Victorian era or the past generally. And atom punk would be stuff that's like written about the space age, between like 1940s and 1970s. And dieselpunk is, just kind of a term of art for period of World War I. The early sort of industrial combustion era. Early radio or early after mass production, but kind of before World War II.
Right, because the big speculative element in this book, as it were, would be the remote-controlled torpedoes, right?
Well, those aren't speculative because there's like one of them in the living room of D'Annunzio's mansion. I mean, they were prototypes rather than speculative objects. But yeah, I mean, D'Annunzio really wanted to have a radio-controlled torpedo, and the Italian military in World War I invented a radio-controlled torpedo. They just never put it into production because peace broke out, and what was the point?
So the speculative element, would you say, is the mass production of the radio-controlled torpedoes?
The speculative element in the story is that my hero actually is a guy with a torpedo factory. So he's like, hey, I'm going to take this prized imaginary weapon and make it real. But if you read the text carefully, you can see that he's probably bullshitting about it. I mean, he tells everybody he can make a flying radio torpedo, but you never see him actually test one. They just claim that they have one, right? Or that they can make a bunch of them. It's like the Israeli nuclear bomb, right? Like everybody knows the Israelis have weapons of mass destruction, maybe 6, maybe 60, but they've never tested one. They've never launched one. It's just, they have the reputation for having them. And the reputation for having nukes is practically as good as having them, and maybe better in some ways. Because, that way you don't get them stolen. You don't have to worry about them being hacked or blown up in their silos or, a rogue general threatening the state. If everybody just thinks you have them, it's like telling everybody you've got a shotgun in your bedroom. It's like nobody's going to barge through the door.
I mean, speaking of the Futurists, one book title in here that kind of jumped out at me is The Manifesto of Futurist Lust.
Yeah.
Sounds kind of like an interesting book.
It's quite interesting. I mean, it really exists. I mean, this woman, the woman who wrote that, Valentine de Saint-Point, she was one of the first European women to be a futurist and then become a Muslim convert. And she ended her days as, like an Egyptian Muslim, nun, basically. I mean, she was really a weird character. I mean, kind of a crazy cabaret dancer. But, there were a lot of seriously crazy women in Europe in the 1920s. I mean, that was, for feminism, that was really a golden era in a lot of ways. You had women doing things that no woman in history had ever dreamed of. I mean, they were radio talk show hosts. They were flying around the world as famous aviatrixes. Women after World War I really were really feeling their oats.
Well, yeah, and I mean, there are a lot of characters in this book that are all, I think, all real. I mean, and I thought this was sort of striking to me because I don't know that I've ever read a novella before that starts off with a list of 22 characters at the beginning.
Right.
Could you say why you wanted to include so many characters in this story?
Well, the editors wanted to put those guys in. I mean, the novella was also published in Italy, and in Italy, nobody has to be told who those people are. I mean, they're pretty famous. But, it's like starting a Shakespeare play with, the dramatis personae. And, sometimes the names are a bit hard to tell apart. So, if Italian is not your first language or your second. So I think it actually helped, and also the map helps a lot. I mean, nobody in Italy has any trouble knowing what goes on in the Adriatic. That's their neighborhood, right? But, if you're English or American or anybody else, it's very handy to have, literally a map in the frontispiece of the book that just says, look, these guys are here and those guys are over there and, the enemy's over here and so forth.
I mean, do you want to say a little bit more about who some of the other real historical characters are that you include in the story?
Well, yeah, there's the character who's called, the Ace of Hearts in the book. Guido Keller was his real name, who I think is, probably the most interesting guy in the enterprise of Fiume, because he's this sort of former flying ace who's this, I don't know, mystical. He's a political liberation mystic, really. And when you see what he was doing and what he was saying, and sort of how he personally wanted to live, he's like probably the first genuine hippie who ever existed. I mean, Guido Keller's life is all about nudity drugs, music, poetry. If it feels good, do it, right? And he's always doing these kinds of eccentric kind of Woodstockian gestures that you just don't see from political activists of his time. Like, you like to go sleep up a tree a lot. That's like, what serious political actor would like live in a tree house? But that's a very 1967 hippie thing to do, right? And he's quite keen on it. It's like, why do you live in the treehouse? Well, I'm one with nature. I like the breezes. I can be naked up in my tree. It's like, and he's like completely serious about it, right? So if you're interested in the history of hippie attitudes, it's just like, why did people behave in this particular kind of, sexually liberated, drug liberated, astrally psychedelic fashion? It didn't come out of nowhere, and he was one of the first people to really kind of try that, and like really get in people's faces.
I mean, so what do you make of the characters' political views in the story? Do you have any sympathy for them, or is it critique, or how do you feel about it?
Well, I try not to be too terribly judgmental about it. I mean, there are a couple of pages where I break character and I just sort of describe what's going on. But I don't know. I mean, I feel like it's almost too easy to kind of cop attitudes about it. It's like, well, fascism is bad. Okay, yeah, fascism is bad, but it's not bad in the way that people imagine it is when you sort of say that it is bad, right? I mean, it's kind of like condemning Satan without ever reading Milton's Paradise Lost. And not only that, but there was a lot of stuff going on in fascism that even the fascists themselves didn't really know about or understand, right? So, rather than sort of saying this is the good guy and this is the bad guy and people should never do this and they should only do that, my attitude is more like, well, situations show up when people kind of lose their wits and like unbelievable stuff goes on. And I think that's actually a more productive way to look at things politically. You ought to think of politics as like, I mean, not like an art form, but it's sort of more like, why are things in popular music the way they are, right? Or why are things in philosophy or literature the way they are? And it's not because the boss or the ruler tells you how things are supposed to be. It's more like there are elements of the human condition where moments occur where there's great fertility for kind of good or bad, or just ruptures in the texture of the normal. And believe me, what went on in the Fiume Enterprise was truly one of the weirdest things that happened in the 20th century. It's really, really a strange business.
I mean, when you say that fascism wasn't bad in the way that people imagine, it was bad in a different way, what do you mean by that?
Well, I think, it's bad in some ways because it plays on people's virtues, right? It's not like fascism suddenly, if the fascists occupy you, it's very obvious how bad they are, right? Like, if you're just hanging around in Libya or Ethiopia and trying to like conduct your daily life of, raising grain, herding the goats, weaving your rugs, just going about your business, then when the fascists arrive, it's obviously very sinister because they take complete control, they subject everybody, they treat you as a racial inferior, and anybody who speaks up just gets beaten or shot. So if you're under fascist occupation, there's very little question that you're suffering a lot and that they're really bad, right? Even though they will like propagandize you and so forth, their contempt for you, really their racial contempt for you and their cultural contempt for you is so overwhelming that you never believe that, right? But if you're inside the fascist tent, it's all about patriotism and the allure of self-sacrifice and how we're bringing civilization to other people, and we're resolving, age-old conflicts in our own society by, uniting around our great leader, the Duce, or the Führer, and it's actually like, exciting. It's like thrilling. I mean, like you go out into the squares, there's like 100,000 people all around you. They're all shouting for the same thing. They're making the same arm gestures. There's like tremendous light shows, fantastic music. The women are excited. Even the 5-year-old child thinks it's great. Your grandparents are overwhelmed by the pageantry, right? You really feel like your civilization is like gotten up on its feet and achieved something fantastic. And people don't understand this kind of brutal allure of this kind of totalitarianism, right? I mean, it is totalizing, and you get sucked into it. This kind of no room outside of it.
You actually say in the book that fascism has some of the same allure as science fiction in a weird way?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's because it has this kind of singularity, kind of, rapture about it. It's just like, okay, maybe it really wouldn't be that great an idea for, like, let's say, take a great science fictional text like Arthur Clarke and Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, right? You like watch a 2001 and it's got like the monolith, and like the monolith's like mysterious and great and cool, and it's kind of evolutionary, and there's like something scientific about it. And then at the end, there's like this moment when like the astronaut turns into the giant space baby, right? And you're like, okay, wow, he's become the giant space baby. But, it's not like anybody voted on the space baby, right? I mean, there's not like an ethics commission that went and like wrote about the space baby. Nobody sort of says, well, wait a minute. What if the space baby turns out to be cruel to certain ethnic minorities, right? I mean, the space baby is just a state accompli, right? It's a fait accompli. I mean, the space baby just sort of happens, and he's like superhuman, right? I mean, he's the infant of some higher state. Right. And okay, that's a great science fictional move because it kind of appeals to the sense of wonder and it's transcendent, but it also obliterates kind of political rationalism or skepticism or a kind of a loyal opposition. There aren't two space babies, right? I mean, there's not like the other space baby who doesn't want to do what Space Baby 1 wants to do, right? I mean, Space Baby 1 is just like, he's it, He's the Ubermensch, right? And I don't want to say that Arthur Clarke is a fascist or that Stanley Kubrick is a fascist. On the contrary, Stanley Kubrick is very aware politically. I mean, he's the guy who directed Dr. Strangelove and, Full Metal Jacket and these other kinds of things. I mean, Stanley Kubrick, very intelligent guy. I'm just saying that there's a kind of rhetorical trick that goes on in science fiction and in fascism that kind of says, don't really worry about what this means to like the guy next door or whomever. It's just like, it's so cool and amazing that you should just surrender yourself to the rapture of its fantasticness. And, and I, as a science fiction reader and writer, I completely get it about that. And in some ways it's good. I mean, if you don't have a sense of wonder, it's like you're dead inside. But, your sense of wonder can be used to trick you, right? I mean, you can have a sense of wonder over a thing that's basically a conjurer's trick or a put-up job or, a con job or a ripoff. And, it's not a simple black and white matter. On the contrary, it's easy to kind of like get yourself all wrapped up in this sense of wonderment and kind of be sincere about it and really, devote yourself to it and just end up bleeding out. I mean, somebody's going to shoot you. I mean, you're going to be defeated if you're a fascist. Because it works great for you, but it doesn't work at all well for the guys that you just invaded, right? I mean, you're going to breed your own opposition through this kind of sense of your own wonderfulness.
Well, I mean, speaking of science fiction, one thing that was interesting, I thought, is that you actually have H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard appear as characters in this book. I was just curious what the thought process was behind that.
Well, they were actually in my mind before the thing started. I mean, I was looking at, what was going on in Fiume and thinking about what was going on in the United States at the same time. And of course, that was the era of Lovecraft. Lovecraft is well known in science fiction circles for his fondness for Hitler and his racial attitudes. I mean, if you read Lovecraft, it's full of the same kind of proto-fascist sentiments that were eventually crystallized by guys like Mussolini and Hitler. It's just that at the time nobody cared. I mean, it wasn't seen as a bad thing. I mean, Lovecraft was from Providence, Rhode Island, and he was famous for really resenting the Italians in Providence, Rhode Island. There were Italians all over the place. And if you read Lovecraft's letters, he's like, he really despises them. He thinks the Italians are some kind of uneducated, dirty underclass of people whose presence in his streets, he resents bitterly. I mean, he has the attitude toward them that like people have towards Syrian emigres now. It's just like, okay, what are these? Who are these people and why are they here? So I thought there was something useful and interesting about making Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard, who's of course the most famous early Texan science fiction writer, into characters. It kind of like it puts the genre on the hook in a way. It's kind of saying, okay, we science fiction writers are also participants, and our ideas have some consequence here, and the ideas in Fiume and Rijeka were very far out. But the ideas of science fiction at that era and the ideas of science fiction today are far out in a similar kind of fashion. Like, what happens when you take these ideas that are basically fantastic and try to apply them practically in a political life, right? And I don't know. I mean, people wonder what they're doing there, but I see them as being participants.
Well, it's interesting because you have Lovecraft and Howard working with Harry Houdini in the espionage field, and you say that that's actually not as far-fetched as it might sound.
No, that happened. I mean, Houdini had a lot of fans in the spy industry, such as it was at the time. There's a lot of documentary evidence about Houdini's involvement with American espionage. And they had good reason to hang out with him. I mean, he was a useful guy to know. And Houdini actually hired Lovecraft, on occasion to do some ghostwriting for him. And, Houdini was carrying out a war against, spiritualists and these kind of superstitious table knocker people who were trying to raise spirits. And Lovecraft also despised that kind of stuff. So the two of them actually had rather a lot to talk about. And besides, Lovecraft was so broke that he was willing to work cheap. So, Houdini and Lovecraft knew one another historically. And they even had things in common. And, to throw Robert E. Howard in there as a teenager is a bit of a stretch. But, Lovecraft knew a lot of teenage science fiction fans, and he certainly knew Robert E. Howard.
Well, right. And speaking of writers being poor, I heard you say that Robert E. Howard would actually type new stories in between the lines of his old stories to save money on paper. I'd never heard that before.
He did that, yeah. I mean, Robert E. Howard actually was a successful pulp writer. He was not a poor guy when he shot himself. He was actually doing pretty well as an American fiction writer. But, if you're like a science fiction writer in the 20s, 30s, 40s, you were guaranteed to be a poor guy. I mean, there weren't very many rich, aristocratic science fiction writers. I mean, you were writing for the pulps. You were scraping the bottom of the barrel. It's like Ray Bradbury, his most famous book, Fahrenheit 451. He typed that book on a rented typewriter, like a coin-operated typewriter, where you had to put in a dime, and you would get like an hour's worth of use of the machine. And then you had to like put in another dime in order to go on typing. And you're thinking, how the heck could Ray Bradbury possibly do this? But, everybody that he knew was doing that. I mean, it was the Depression. And also to be a freelance writer is just I mean, it's well rewarded if you're famous, but if you're an unknown freelance writer, man, you're the starving artist, flat out.
Yeah, well, I know about that.
Yeah,
Um,
that's how it is.
I mean, you say, I thought this was interesting. You say that people make fun of Lovecraft, but for the wrong reasons. Could you say what you mean by that?
Well, I think he's like a figure from silent film. It's just been a long time. I mean, people in silent film have all kinds of cliches about what was going on in silent movies. They think, oh, it's all about girls tied to railroad tracks. Okay, there aren't any silent movies with girls tied to railroad tracks. I mean, it's a cliche, but it doesn't really exist at all, right? And everybody has like ideas about what Lovecraft was into, but they don't go into like the tall weeds. I mean, they don't actually like read Lovecraft's letters or read the letters of other people. They don't understand what like amateur press associations were. They don't understand Hugo Gernsback. They don't understand radio parts catalogs. They don't understand the relationship between guys like Gernsback and Tesla. I mean, with the passage of time, you have to kind of pack things down and compress them. But then when you go back to the original documentation, you realize that their lives are every bit as complicated as ours, and in some ways more so, right? So, I mean, people would say things like Lovecraft was an anti-Semite. Okay, Lovecraft was a racist, but he wasn't a racist against Jews. He had this completely different kind of racism that, I mean, he's like his wife was Jewish, right? He had like ideas about race that really no longer hold water. I mean, people aren't even aware of them. He had like ideas about race that were sort of based in the ideas of Herbert Spencer and kind of ideas of like genetic entropy or inbreeding, right? That were kind of pseudo-scientific, but like based in doctrines that like, even contemporary fascists know nothing about, right? So, I mean, yeah, he was a racist, but he wasn't a racist as we understand racism right now, right? And kind of, I mean, he had weird ideas, but they weren't irrational weird ideas. They were all ideas that were kind of based in the science of his time. And, people who write about Lovecraft, they imagine him as this kind of weakling or, a kind of a timorous figure or a guy who was afraid all the time because he wrote horror fiction. But then when you look at Lovecraft's actual relationships to people, in most of his daily interactions, people around Lovecraft really respected him a lot. I mean, they considered him a gentleman, a very well educated guy, possibly a great writer. He knew lots of young people who really looked up to him. His colleagues in Weird Tales thought he was the best writer in Weird Tales. Guys who were, arty science fiction people, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, they thought the world of Lovecraft. They really considered him, kind of the guru of their group. So I don't know. I mean, you have to be willing to kind of drop the blinders there and go look at people sympathetically, not through your own lens, but just try to understand how they experienced life.
Well, it's interesting because the Lovecraft character in your story seems to have had some sort of political conversion as a result of having a son.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, fatherhood has a big change on men. And, it's like, why would Lovecraft? I mean, Lovecraft was famous for, he's not famous, but maybe the most significant thing that happened in his life was when he left Providence, his hometown, and actually tried to make a go of it in New York. He basically moved to New York in order to marry one of his pen pals, who was his wife, Sonia Green, who was, a hat maker, but a wannabe writer in the American Press Association. So the two of them were like writing these kind of tender letters to one another. And then Lovecraft, who's like basically alone in Providence, says, you know what? I'm just going to like make a go of it. I'm going to like throw everything out and I'm going to like cast myself into the arms of this romantic Jewish woman with her like hat store. And like, I'm going to like move to Manhattan. And, that was very courageous of him, but the marriage didn't work out, right? So, eventually he just left her and he went back to Providence and kind of grew ever more lonely and cranky. But, imagine that he had gone to New York and like he and Sonia had had a child. Well, Lovecraft was always the gentleman, and there was no way that he would have like abandoned a wife and child. It's just not done in the period. So you have to imagine him casting about for some means to support his young family. And I thought it was like plausible that he would enter advertising. Because why not? I mean, that's what people do in New York, right? I mean, you could write for Harry Houdini. He's not going to pay you very much. But if you want to just write copy and get a lot of money for it, Madison Avenue is where it's at. So the idea of, Lovecraft as a copywriter, I guess seems a bit cynical, but I don't think it's even particularly far-fetched.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about this one blurb. So James Morrow on this book, he calls it an allegory of our present geopolitics. I was just curious if you see it that way.
Yeah, I think we've got a lot of, I wouldn't call it an allegory per se, but I think the confusion that we have now, and especially the kind of new wave of, anti-global neo-nationalism is very similar to what was going on after the end of World War One. After the end of World War One, it was kind of the breakdown of large empires like the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Suddenly there were all these states kind of popping up and asserting their own rights. And, the European Union's coming apart. We've got like a lot of frozen conflict areas where, people would like to be nations, but they can't get it together to be nations. And I also think there's just a kind of similar political obscurantism, going on that's like similar to the kind of D'Annunzio style of poetic post-truthism, because D'Annunzio was a poet and really a great poet. And if you went to live in Fiume during the 22 months or whatever that it was a going business, you were basically living on this guy's lectures because the economy collapsed, business collapsed. There was nothing else except to listen to him carry on as a demagogue. And he was a great demagogue. And we've got a lot of people who just want to sit down with their bowl of porridge and eat that demagoguery right now.
There's this quote from you I came across where you say, "I'm an entertainer in the military entertainment complex." I was just wondering, how does that figure into this?
I think that was a pretty good thing to say about 15 years ago, because we had a military entertainment complex. Because, people talk about the military industrial complex, and I think that still exists to an extent. But the military entertainment complex was more like Nintendo war, right? It's like, okay, we have the war and we put the war through the major media channels, and and people kind of go through that, and like the war is a game, the war is kind of inherently entertaining, and we're like, we have military problems, but they're kind of filtered through our media structure. And I got it about that because I knew a lot about war, and I'm not a military guy, but I was interested in the troubles of the time, or else I wouldn't be living part of my time in Belgrade. But I think that era is now gone. We don't really have a military entertainment complex of the kind. We have a military, and we have social media.
Because what that quote sort of suggested to me was that almost you can't help but become complicit in some of these systems. But do you feel that that's, do you agree with that, or do you think that you can actually sort of fight the system by selling?
I actually think that you can drop out, or like establish an alternate way of life, which is why I'm a big fan of Václav Havel. Václav Havel, the famous Czech rebel of the Velvet Revolution, is like a dissident playwright, hippie rock and roll fan who, became president of the Czech Republic eventually. I mean, Havel wrote a number of essays, about living in truth, which I think are very useful and interesting right now. I mean, kind of more interesting now than they were when he wrote them in the early 1980s, which are like, okay, if you're surrounded by organized deceit, what can you do to kind of maintain your own sincerity and not become complicit in the oppression, right? And he had some kind of useful advice on how to do that, and really, how to live the kind of pre-89 or 9, dissident life. I don't think you have to be complicit, but you're complicit in some ways just because you're like a human being, right? I mean, you're like using the same language as other people. You're married to people, your relatives are like them. And I don't think complicit is like necessarily a pejorative term. I think it's more like engagement, right? And I think engagement is important. I mean, you can do the kinds of things Havel talked about. It's like, okay, I'm going to like kind of appoint myself a moral leader and kind of refuse to have anything to do with this. I'm like the resistance. But even Havel himself didn't stay that way. I mean, when people actually wanted him to become head of state, he famously said, look, I can't spend my whole life complaining about the situation and then do nothing constructive when I have the chance to do it, right? And you can't say that like the president of the country is like not complicit in the country, right? I mean, yeah, I mean, he was the president. He was like the president for like 2 or 3 terms. So, the complicity is like a thing that kind of comes and goes and like goes with other situations. And, I mean, I have my own relationship to kind of Italy as a country. I'm very interested in it. I like Italian literature a lot. They are the country that was the birthplace of fascism. But I don't think I'm complicit with fascism. What I would like to be is like engaged with the Italian historical experience. It's like, why did the people in this region behave as they did, right? And I don't think it's fair of me to sort of say, well, I never did that, and I'm like an American, and we had nothing to do with what you were doing, right? And so we can kind of condemn it rigorously and have nothing to do with you. I mean, that strikes me as like bad literature. It might be like effective politics in some ways. It's like, look, we're different from you, very different from you, and we're going to tell you how to behave, and you should behave like this. I mean, there are circumstances where a nation can say that to another nation, and it's actually helpful. But for somebody who's like engaged with the experience of people in a society, you shouldn't sort of say, I love you for your virtues, but I hate you for your sins. On the contrary, you sort of have to say, I understand your value system and why your virtues are sometimes your sins.
I wanted to ask you about this quote in the afterword. There's an afterword written by Christopher Brown, and he talks about how various segments of society have given up on the idea of presenting an optimistic future, and so it's fallen to science fiction writers to do that. But then he goes on to say that most science fiction writers find that it's dystopia that actually pays the bills.
That's very weird. I mean, I'm like a guy in my 60s now, and the idea of dystopia paying the bills is like a super alien idea for a guy who grew up reading commercial sci-fi in the 1960s and 1970s. Because if you wrote a dystopia in that period, it was like, okay, you really have to go, beat the knuckles of Ace Books or Ballantine Books or the other, major sci-fi publishers of the period to get them to print a book with a downbeat ending. It's just not something you would do at all. But yeah, I mean, dystopia actually sells pretty well now, but it doesn't sell anywhere near as well. It's just like complete fantasy, kind of, teenage vampire books or, Harry Potter books or, Game of Thrones or epic sort of gameable fantasies are what really sell. Dystopias don't really sell all that well. They sell kind of okay, but they're not the major imaginative genres, the subgenres of our era. And but I think Chris is right in that optimism sells even less. I mean, if you try to like write a sci-fi anthology or something which sort of says, boy, it's 2017 and things are going great. It's like, let's lift our chin up. I mean, it's just such an obvious phoniness about that whole idea. Nobody believes it. I mean, the old don't believe it, the young don't believe it, the right doesn't believe it, the left doesn't believe it. And the only major group who believes that kind of thing are the Chinese. I mean, the Chinese have the only kind of majority optimist population going right now. And everybody else has, I think, a much more realistic assessment of the nature of contemporary living. And I think optimism is okay, but false optimism is wicked. Right? I mean, it's really hypocrisy and not a sort of thing you should do.
I was actually really curious to ask you about the period you were just talking about, where the science fiction publishers wouldn't publish Dystopias and things like that. This is what led you to edit your fanzine Cheap Truth. Do I have that right?
No, not really. I mean, that was actually the struggle of an earlier generation. That's more like the new wave struggle of the 1960s, where you had like a lot of upbeat sci-fi writers who were, basically space age enthusiasts. And then you had all these, dropouts and refuseniks who were like against the Vietnam War. And, they were like, oh, this is terrible. We're like into a gruesome kind of, apocalypse now situation. And you had a lot of science fiction writers of the older generation who were like, come on, we're going to defeat communism. They'll be reeling, things are going to be great. And, in some ways they were right. I mean, the right-wing guys of the period were correct that the West was going to defeat communism. They did defeat communism, and in the 1990s, things were kind of great for a little while. It's just that history doesn't end and things just get really complicated. But there's still a school of science fiction writers that are kind of the pep talk school that are like, why are we writing about the future and trying to convince people it's going to be terrible? Isn't there something morally suspect about that? And in a way, it's true. It's like being in some kind of gothic rock band where your problem is like to make teenagers feel more unhappy about themselves. Like, how hard can that be? It's just, why are you like making the effort to be a downer? And I understand that situation, but I don't like to. I don't know. I don't like to be untrue to myself, really.
But I mean, Cheap Truth is described as sort of attacking, quote, the stagnant state of popular science fiction. What was the stagnancy at that time?
Well, the real Cheap Truth slogan was the honesty of complete desperation, which I think is kind of good. It's like, okay, we're just gonna like write under pseudonyms and kind of like lay it on the line here. And I think that can be very brisk and refreshing. I mean, I think the stagnation we were decrying was not as complete as it was. I mean, there was stuff going on in the 1970s that looks pretty dynamic, compared to what we're doing now. But I think if you're writing literary manifestos, which we were definitely doing, what you're really saying is like, I want to overcome my own stagnation. Right? Just like, I don't know what to do. And I'm looking for like a fresh breeze where I can raise my sails. At that point, it's like, okay, look, this seems to be a breeze. Let's like put the sails up. And, and if that happens, then, hey, man, you're like moving right along and things are groovy. And, you just shouldn't, when I go back and look at writings of that kind, I can see that I'm chiding other people a little bit, but mostly I'm giving pep talks to myself and people in my inner circle.
And so why were you using pseudonyms? Were you afraid people would stop publishing you, or what was the concern?
I just like writing under other voices, really. It's like, it's kind of a personal quirk. I mean, in point of fact, people were very kind to us cyberpunks, critically speaking. I mean, we've always been critics' darlings compared to like the hell that like new wave writers of the 1960s went through, you were like, really pretty rigorously condemned by the status quo. I mean, just they were like not okay. On the contrary, people in the 1980s, and even late 1970s were really happy and pleased to see a generation of science fiction writers come up who wanted to talk about computers. No, I mean, nobody was cruel to us. I mean, I don't even get flamed by people on Twitter, which is kind of weird. We had like kind of a few quarrels with people as cyberpunks. I mean, they were like, there were debates, but by the standards of like literary quarrels, we had a very friendly reception, and we really don't have any enemies. It's hard to find somebody in science fiction who doesn't admire William Gibson. I mean, there's no organized anti-William Gibson sensibility. On the contrary, it's you either sort of like him or you really, really like him. Which is a strange thing for a literary movement. And that was, so we were fortunate in that, but we also had like just a lot of groundwork to do and trying to decide what we wanted to talk about and what kind of voice we were going to have, and what our topics were and kind of what our approach was. And really the best way to do that is in a small press publication, really a fanzine. You don't want to trouble the whole world with that. You want to trouble about 300 guys.
I mean, does your experience editing that fanzine, do you have any advice for other people who might want to do a science fiction fanzine?
It's impossible to do it on paper anymore. I mean, maybe you could do it on paper. I don't really have advice. I mean, this is a very peculiar media situation that we're in now. We were doing it with like Xerox prints, and kind of, I mean, Cheap Truth was famously uncopyrighted. You were supposed to go out and like make copies of it. It was kind of an early attempt at like open source documentation, but that era is just long gone. And it's like going out and telling people to do something on Super 8 film or 16 millimeter. It's just gone. So, I mean, the only advice I would have is to like find people your own age, right? I mean, if you're really going to do something new, you cannot trust people my age to give you good advice. They will give you advice that they think is good, but they just don't know what's happening. And if you imitate them, you're going to be reduced to pastiche. You really have to find guys your own age, women your own age, and try to establish your own cultural sensibility of your own period.
Okay, well, my next question was going to be, do you have any advice for science fiction podcasters? But I guess I'll have to go ask somebody my own age about that.
I think that would be good. I kind of like podcasts. I listen to a few. But, I'm not really a big fan of spoken word or radio. And people often told me I should do my own podcast, but, I don't really fancy myself in that line of work. I mean, I'm very grateful that there are people who are still science fiction critics. And I'm also grateful for the input of science fiction fandom. I think it's great that there are people who are not professional writers, who aren't editors, or not critics, or not in academia, who just are willing to sort of say, hi, I'm like Joe from East St. Louis, and like I read these 5 books this month, and I think this one's good, and this other one is not good. I think that's been true of the genre since the 1920s, and I would hate to see us lose that kind of ground truth. I think it's really important to the nature of the genre that there aren't these huge divisions between fandom and prodom.
Yeah. Okay, so Bruce, so we're pretty much out of time. So just to wrap things up, is there anything else you want to mention? Any other projects or posts or anything you want to point people to?
We spent a lot of time talking about Italy here, and people have read this novella of mine, Pirate Utopia, and they think, boy, like what a weird thing. They don't realize I've written like 10 other fantascienza stories about Italy, right? Because I have, right? So I've like spent my time in Italy becoming an Italian fantascienza writer. and, uh, and I think this is the year I'm actually going to write my Italian fantascienza novel. Right? I mean, many people have asked me, it's like, why is it Pirate Utopia novel? I don't think there's enough there to make a novel, but I actually think I have a topic now, which is going to be like, the Bruce Sterling novel. And I haven't written one in like 5 or 6 years because I didn't feel the need. But I actually do feel the need now. And, hopefully, if we're not, incinerated in the Donald Trump apocalypse, which is something I'm not real worried about, by the way. I think I'm actually going to like write a new book with like a refreshing and interesting topic. And I think it's going to be kind of lighthearted and adventurous book. And, I hope that works out.
All right. Well, definitely looking forward to that. And so we've been speaking with Bruce Sterling, and this new book, again, it's called Pirate Utopia. And so, Bruce, thank you so much for joining us.
Good luck with that, David. You keep after it.
Thank you.
Bye.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Bruce Sterling for joining us on the show. Special thanks as well to Martin Wimbish, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time or fixed monthly contribution, you can do that via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. I'd also like to thank Audible and Atom Tickets for sponsoring today's show. As the host of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy, I need to watch a lot of the new movies that come out, and sometimes I even have friends to go with me, hard as that may be to believe. Well, Atom Tickets makes it easy to plan those sorts of movie outings right on your phone. You select the movies you'd like to see, select a range of possible times, and then pick which friends you'd like to invite, with all your friends' info imported automatically from your contacts. Your friends receive alerts which let them vote on which movie they want to see and when, and then you decide what the final plan will be, and you can easily buy tickets for yourself and anyone else you choose. I tried out the app this week when my girlfriend Stephanie and I went to see the new film Hidden Figures, about a trio of African-American women who were vital to the U.S. space program, which incidentally is a movie I highly, highly recommend. An hour or so before the movie, I used the app to buy tickets for Stephanie and myself, and I also used the app to purchase a snack from the concession stand. When I got to the theater, I walked up to the concession stand, got in a special line for Atom Tickets customers, and picked up my snack by scanning the QR code on my phone. Then I showed that same QR code to the person collecting tickets in order to get into the movie. When Stephanie arrived a bit later, she showed the QR code on her phone to the person collecting tickets and came and joined me in the theater. So we were able to bypass both the line to buy tickets and the line to buy snacks. Because of her schedule, Stephanie's often running late if we go to see a movie on a weeknight, and if I've paid for her ticket, it can be a real pain, because the movie will start before she gets there, and then I have to keep an eye out for her text and hurry out to the lobby so that I can give her ticket. So using the Atom Tickets app made that a lot easier, because everything she needed was right there on her phone. So if you want to check out the app, it's called Atom Tickets, ATOM Tickets, and it's available now from the App Store or Google Play. And remember that you can also get $5 off your first order by using the promo code GALAXY. Alright, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.